April 1998, Beacon Theater, New York City. The VH1 Divas Live concert was about to make television history, bringing together five of the greatest voices in music for one unforgettable night. Celine Dion, Gloria Estefan, Aretha Franklin, Shania Twain, and of course, Whitney Houston and Mariah Carey. But what the 2,800 people in that theater and the millions watching at home didn't know was that backstage, something extraordinary was unfolding. Something that would shatter every tabloid narrative about diva rivalries and reveal a truth the music industry had desperately tried to hide. Mariah Carey, at 28 years old and already a superstar in her own right, had arrived at the venue 3 hours early. Not because she needed extra time for hair and makeup, but because she had one secret mission. She wanted to watch Whitney Houston prepare. For years, the media had manufactured a bitter rivalry between these two women, constantly comparing their vocal ranges, their chart positions, their every move. Headlines screamed about catfights and jealousy, about two divas who supposedly couldn't stand to be in the same room. But the truth was far more complicated and infinitely more beautiful. What Mariah witnessed that afternoon from her hidden vantage point in the wings would not only change how she approached her own artistry, but would reveal the crushing weight of perfection that Whitney carried every single day. If you want to discover the untold story of what really happens when the world's greatest voices come together, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story will show you that sometimes the fiercest competition is the one we have with ourselves. Let's dive into the moment when Mariah Carey learned the heartbreaking truth about being Whitney Houston. To understand what Mariah saw that day, you need to understand what Whitney Houston represented in 1998. She wasn't just a singer. She was the standard by which every female vocalist was measured. When Whitney burst onto the scene in 1985 with her self-titled debut album, she didn't just succeed, she redefined what success meant. 7 consecutive #1 singles. The best-selling debut album by a female artist. A voice so technically perfect that vocal coaches used her recordings to teach proper technique. But by 1998, 13 years into superstardom, Whitney was carrying a burden that few people could comprehend. Every performance had to be flawless. Every note had to be perfect. Every appearance had to prove that she was still the Whitney Houston, the woman who had seemingly emerged fully formed as the greatest voice of her generation. The pressure had been building for over a decade. In the recording studio, engineers and producers had witnessed Whitney's increasing anxiety about her performances. She would insist on doing take after take, sometimes 50 or 60 attempts at a single vocal line, convinced that she could hear imperfections that no one else detected. Her longtime vocal coach, Gary Katona, had watched the transformation with growing concern. In the early days, Whitney sang with joy and freedom, he recalled years later. But as her legend grew, so did her fear of not living up to it. She became terrified of being human, of having an off day, of showing any weakness. The tabloid media's obsession with comparing Whitney to every new female vocalist only intensified the pressure. When Mariah Carey exploded onto the scene in 1990 with her remarkable 5-octave range and whistle register, the comparisons were immediate and relentless. Magazine covers asked who was better. Radio DJs debated their respective talents. Music critics wrote endless think pieces analyzing every aspect of their voices. For Whitney, who had been the undisputed queen for 5 years, the emergence of another vocalist with comparable technical abilities triggered something deep and painful. It wasn't jealousy. It was fear. Fear that she could be replaced, that her reign could end, that she might not be special anymore. But what the media never understood, and what Mariah would discover that day at the Beacon Theater, was that Whitney's real competition had never been with other singers. It had always been with the impossible standard of perfection she had set for herself, and that the world now demanded she maintain every single time she opened her mouth to sing. Mariah Carey arrived at the Beacon Theater at 2 p.m. for a show that wouldn't start until 8 p.m. Her official call time wasn't until 5 o'clock, but she had specifically requested earlier access to the venue. Her management team assumed she wanted extra rehearsal time or needed the dressing room for an extended glam session. But Mariah had a completely different agenda. For 8 years, since her debut in 1990, Mariah had lived in Whitney's shadow, while simultaneously being positioned as her rival. Every album she released was compared to Whitney's. Every vocal performance was measured against Whitney's standard. Every award she won was framed as a victory over Whitney. The narrative had become suffocating. What frustrated Mariah most was how the media had created this fabricated animosity between them. In the rare moments when they had crossed paths at industry events, Whitney had been nothing but gracious and encouraging. But those brief interactions had always been public, carefully watched, and quickly spun into gossip column fodder about fake smiles and forced politeness. Mariah wanted to see the real Whitney, not the carefully curated public persona, not the diva in performance mode, but the artist behind closed doors. She wanted to understand how Whitney maintained that extraordinary instrument, how she prepared, how she dealt with the pressure, how she stayed at the top for so long. So Mariah made a plan. She spoke quietly with the stage manager, someone she had worked with on previous projects, and asked for a favor. I just want to watch from the wings during Whitney's sound check and preparation. Nobody needs to know I'm there. Just let me observe. The stage manager, understanding the sensitivity of the request, agreed to position Mariah in a secluded spot in the wings where she would have a perfect view of Whitney's dressing room area and warm-up space, but where Whitney wouldn't see her. At 2:30 p.m., Mariah took her hidden position in the darkened wings of the Beacon Theater stage. She had a folding chair, a bottle of water, and a clear sight line to where Whitney would soon arrive. And then she waited. Whitney arrived at 3 p.m., exactly 1 hour after Mariah had taken her position. What Mariah observed over the next 4 hours would fundamentally change how she understood both Whitney Houston and the cost of being considered perfect. Whitney Houston walked into the Beacon Theater through the backstage entrance with an entourage of about 8 people. Her assistant, her makeup artist, her hairstylist, 2 bodyguards, her vocal coach Gary Katona, her longtime friend and background singer BB Winans, and a VH1 producer coordinating her segment. To everyone watching, Whitney looked exactly as expected, impeccably dressed in casual elegance, moving with that characteristic grace, smiling and greeting the venue staff with warmth. But Mariah, watching intently from her hidden vantage point, noticed something others might have missed. Whitney's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Her movements, while fluid, carried a slight tension in her shoulders. And her hands, Mariah noticed, were trembling almost imperceptibly. Whitney went directly to her assigned dressing room, a large space that had been specifically prepared with her requested items. Throat coat tea, honey, lemon, a humidifier, specific lighting, and a full-length mirror. For about 20 minutes, Whitney simply sat alone in that dressing room. Her team had dispersed to handle various preparations, giving her private time. Mariah watched as Whitney stared at herself in the mirror, not with vanity, but with what looked like assessment. She was studying herself, examining something only she could see. Then Whitney did something that surprised Mariah. She pulled out a small notebook from her bag and began writing. For nearly 15 minutes, Whitney wrote continuously, occasionally pausing to close her eyes, take deep breaths, and then continue writing. Years later, when Mariah finally spoke about this experience, she described this moment as revelatory. I realized she was journaling. She was working through something emotional before she could even begin the physical preparation. That's when I understood that for Whitney, performing wasn't just about vocal technique. It was about emotional excavation. At 3:45, Gary Katona, Whitney's vocal coach, entered the dressing room, and the preparation session began. What Mariah witnessed over the next 2 hours was both awe-inspiring and heartbreaking. It was a masterclass in vocal technique, but it was also a window into the psychological prison that perfectionism had built around one of the greatest natural talents in music history. Gary Katona started Whitney's warm-up with the most basic exercises imaginable. Simple humming. Just gentle, sustained hums on comfortable mid-range pitches. Nothing that would strain or showcase her incredible range. Mariah, herself a trained vocalist, recognized these as fundamental exercises that any beginning singer might do. But what struck her was how seriously Whitney approached even these simple sounds. Whitney wasn't just humming. She was listening intently to every vibration, feeling the resonance in her face and chest, making micro-adjustments to her breath support and placement. After about 10 minutes of humming, Gary moved Whitney to lip trills, those motorboat sounds that singers use to keep their vocal cords relaxed while building breath support. Again, basic technique. But Whitney did them with such focus and precision that it elevated the exercise into something approaching meditation. She did patterns that went up and down her range, but never pushing, never forcing. Always with this careful, almost fearful precision. Then came the scales. Gary played notes on a small keyboard he had brought, and Whitney sang through various vowel sounds. Mariah listened as Whitney moved through her range, and even in these warm-up exercises, the beauty of that instrument was undeniable. But something else was undeniable too. Whitney's anxiety. Every few minutes, Whitney would stop mid-exercise and ask Gary questions. Did that sound nasal? Was I sharp on that G? Is there any breathiness? Do you hear any fatigue? Gary would patiently reassure her that everything sounded perfect, that her voice was responding beautifully, that she had nothing to worry about. But Whitney couldn't seem to believe him. She would nod, smile tensely, and then immediately question the next phrase she sang. Mariah found herself leaning forward in her hidden position, completely absorbed. She had never seen this side of Whitney. In public, Whitney always appeared supremely confident, almost regal in her certainty about her abilities. But here, in private preparation, she was vulnerable and doubtful, constantly seeking validation that she was still good enough. About 90 minutes into the warm-up session, something happened that Mariah would never forget. Whitney was working through a section of I Have Nothing, one of her signature songs from The Bodyguard. She was preparing for her solo performance of it later that evening. Gary played the dramatic climax of the song, and Whitney went for the famous sustained high note. She hit perfectly. The note rang out pure, powerful, and absolutely flawless. Gary smiled and said, "Perfect, Nip. That's the money note right there." But Whitney shook her head. "Again," she said. Gary looked confused. "Whitney, that was perfect. You nailed it. I could do it better." Again. They ran it again. Once more, Whitney hit the note perfectly. And once more, she insisted on another take. This pattern repeated 7 times. 7 perfect renditions of one of the most difficult vocal moments in modern pop music. But each time, Whitney found some microscopic flaw that no one else could hear. On the 8th attempt, something in Gary's expression changed from patient to concerned. "Whitney, your voice is warmed up. It sounds incredible. But if we keep pushing this, you're going to fatigue before the show. Please, trust me. You're ready." Whitney's eyes filled with tears. She didn't cry, didn't let them fall, but Mariah saw them clearly from her position in the wings. "What if I can't do it tonight?" Whitney asked, her voice small and frightened. "What if I get out there and it's not perfect? What if I'm not Whitney Houston anymore?" That moment, Mariah later said, shattered every assumption she had ever made about Whitney. This wasn't a confident diva. This was a deeply wounded artist who had been carrying the weight of the world's expectations for so long that she no longer trusted her own extraordinary gift. Gary Cadona sat down next to Whitney and took her hands. What followed was clearly a conversation they had shared many times before, a ritual of reassurance that had become as necessary to Whitney's preparation as the vocal exercises themselves. "You are Whitney Houston," Gary said gently, "not because of one perfect note, but because of who you are as an artist and as a person. Your voice is a gift, but it's not the only thing that makes you special." Whitney nodded, but her expression showed she didn't quite believe him. "The world expects perfect," she said. "Every single time. If I'm anything less than perfect, it's a headline. It's proof that I'm losing it, that someone younger and better is going to take my place. Is that what this is about?" Gary asked. "The comparisons? The new singers?" Whitney glanced away, confirming without words. From her hidden position, Mariah felt her stomach tighten. She suddenly understood that she, along with every other talented young vocalist who had emerged in the 90s, had unknowingly contributed to Whitney's burden. They hadn't chosen to be positioned as rivals, but the media's constant comparisons had created a competitive environment that was crushing someone who should have been celebrated, not constantly defending her throne. "Mariah Carey is incredibly talented," Gary said, seemingly reading Whitney's thoughts. "So is Celine. So is Toni Braxton. So are dozens of new artists. But none of them are you. None of them have your specific combination of technical skill, emotional depth, and presence. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. Whitney's response was barely audible, but Mariah heard it clearly. I have to prove it to myself. That confession hung in the air like a weight. Gary squeezed Whitney's hands. Then let tonight be about joy instead of proof. Let it be about the music instead of the measurement. Let yourself be human. Whitney took a deep breath, nodded, and stood up. Okay, let's do this. But as she moved to continue her preparation, Mariah saw Whitney glance at herself in the mirror one more time with that same assessing, doubtful expression. The battle wasn't over. It might never be over. For the next hour, Mariah watched as Whitney continued her preparation with meticulous detail. She worked through every song she would perform that night, not at full voice, but carefully marking the difficult passages, mapping out her breath control, planning her dynamics. BB Winans joined her for a duet rehearsal, and Mariah watched as Whitney's demeanor shifted slightly. When singing with someone else, especially someone she trusted, Whitney seemed more relaxed. The pressure seemed to lift just a bit when the focus wasn't entirely on her. But then BB left, and Whitney returned to solitary preparation, and the anxiety returned to her face. At 6:30, 2 hours before the show, Whitney's hair and makeup team entered to begin final preparations. While they worked, Whitney continued vocal exercises, humming and doing gentle scales, even as curling irons and makeup brushes transformed her appearance. Mariah was struck by the discipline. For Whitney, there was no moment of relaxation, no time when she wasn't actively preparing, monitoring, controlling every aspect of her performance. At 7:15, Whitney was fully dressed in her performance outfit, a stunning gown that made her look every inch the superstar. Her hair and makeup were flawless. Physically, she was ready, but Mariah noticed that Whitney's hands were still trembling slightly, and she kept drinking tea and doing breathing exercises right up until the last possible moment. At 7:45, a production assistant knocked on the dressing room door. "Ms. Houston, we need you for a final sound check on stage before the audience enters." Whitney nodded, took one final look in the mirror, and headed toward the stage. She would walk right past Mariah's hidden position in the wings. As Whitney approached, Mariah held her breath, not wanting to be discovered. But then something unexpected happened. Whitney walked onto the stage for the final sound check, and Mariah watched from the wings as the artist she had been secretly observing for 4 hours stepped into her element. The stage lights came up, and Whitney took her position at the microphone. "Let me try 'em, every woman," Whitney said to the sound engineer. The track started, and Whitney began to sing. Even at half voice, just testing levels and monitoring placement, the power and beauty of that instrument was breathtaking. Mariah felt chills run down her spine. After everything she had witnessed, the doubt and anxiety and fear, Whitney still produced sounds that seemed to come from somewhere beyond human capability. The sound check lasted about 15 minutes. Whitney was professional and efficient, giving the engineers what they needed while conserving her energy for the actual performance. When she finished, she thanked the crew and turned to walk back to her dressing room. And that's when she saw Mariah. Mariah's hidden position in the wings had been perfect for observing the dressing room area, but left her exposed to anyone on the stage. Whitney stopped mid-stride, clearly surprised to see another performer in the wings so early. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither woman spoke. Mariah felt her face flush with embarrassment. She had been caught. But then something shifted in Whitney's expression. The surprise softened into something that looked like understanding, maybe even recognition of a kindred spirit. "How long have you been there?" Whitney asked quietly, moving closer to the wings where Mariah sat. Mariah considered lying, but something about the vulnerability she had witnessed over the past 4 hours made dishonesty feel wrong. "Since 3 o'clock, she admitted. "I wanted to watch how you prepare." "I'm sorry, I should have asked permission. Whitney raised a hand, stopping her. "You wanted to see if the rumors were true? If I'm really as difficult and demanding as they say?" "No," Mariah said quickly. "I wanted to see how you stay so perfect." Whitney's laugh was bitter and knowing. "Perfect," she repeated. "Is that what you think you saw?" Mariah stood up from her chair, stepping slightly closer. "I saw 4 hours of the most intense preparation I've ever witnessed. I saw a master craftsman treating her instrument with respect and discipline. I saw," she paused, choosing her words carefully. I saw the weight you carry. Whitney's expression changed. The polished facade cracked just slightly, revealing the raw emotion underneath. How much did you hear? Enough to understand that we're not rivals, Mariah said. We're both just trying to survive the same impossible expectations. For a long moment, Whitney studied Mariah's face as if deciding whether to trust her with something precious. Then she said, "Walk with me." Whitney led Mariah to a quiet corner backstage, away from the production crew and other performers who were beginning to arrive. For the first time since the manufactured rivalry began 8 years earlier, the two greatest voices of their generation had a private, honest conversation. "Do you know what it's like," Whitney began, "to have your identity so completely wrapped up in one thing that you're terrified of losing it? Not just your career or your success, but your actual sense of who you are." Mariah nodded slowly. "I think I'm starting to understand. When I first started singing professionally, I was just a girl from Newark who loved gospel music," Whitney continued. "Then I had success, and suddenly I became the voice. Capital T, capital V. And once you become an icon, once you become the standard, you can't ever just be human again. Every note you sing is compared to every other note you've ever sung. Every performance is measured against your best performance. And God forbid you have an off night, because then the headlines write your obituary. Is Whitney losing it? Has age finally caught her voice? Is the reign finally over?" The pain in Whitney's voice was palpable. Mariah felt tears pricking her own eyes. "And then you came along," Whitney said, and Mariah braced herself for resentment. But what she heard instead was something different. "And you were so talented. That range, those runs, that technique. And I watched them do to you what they did to me, turn you into a symbol instead of a person. And I knew exactly what you were going through, but the industry, the media, they wanted us to be enemies. They needed us to be enemies because the story of two women who could support each other wasn't as interesting as a catfight. I never wanted to be your rival," Mariah said. "I wanted to be your colleague, your peer." "I know," Whitney said, "but the machine doesn't care what we want. It needs the narrative." Whitney looked out at the empty theater, soon to be filled with thousands of expectant fans. "You saw me in there, doubting myself, questioning every note. That's what happens when you're supposed to be perfect. You start to believe that's all you are. And the moment you're not perfect, you're nothing." "That's not true," Mariah said firmly. "Your humanity, your vulnerability, that's what makes your artistry powerful. The perfection is just technique. The emotion is what moves people." Whitney smiled sadly. "Logically, I know that. But emotionally, I've been running on fear for so long, I don't remember how to run on joy." "What if we change the narrative?" Mariah suggested. "What if we showed them that we're not rivals, that we support each other?" Whitney shook her head. "They'll never let that story win. Women supporting women doesn't sell magazines." "Maybe not," Mariah agreed. "But it might save us from destroying ourselves, trying to be what they want us to be." The VH1 Divas live concert began at 8 p.m., and for the next 3 hours, millions of people around the world watched 5 incredible vocalists deliver stunning performances. But for Mariah Carey, everything about that night looked different after what she had witnessed backstage. When Whitney performed "I'm Every Woman," Mariah wasn't watching a competitor. She was watching a woman fighting an invisible battle against her own impossible standards. When Whitney hit the high notes in "I Have Nothing," Mariah wasn't hearing technical perfection. She was hearing the result of hours of anxiety and preparation that nobody else saw. And when Whitney joined the other divas for the group finale, Mariah noticed something that probably no one else did. When the 5 singers stood together, sharing the spotlight rather than competing for it, Whitney's entire demeanor changed. The tension in her shoulders relaxed. The fear in her eyes softened. For the first time all day, Whitney looked like she was enjoying herself. The planned finale was all 5 divas singing together, but as they reached the final chorus, something spontaneous happened. Mariah stepped forward to take a solo moment, as planned. But instead of using it to showcase her own abilities, she did something that shocked everyone watching, including Whitney. Mariah turned to Whitney, extended her hand, and pulled her forward to share the moment. It wasn't a competitive trade-off of vocal runs. It was genuine collaboration, 2 voices blending rather than battling. The other divas, seeing what was happening, joined in creating a moment of true unity rather than rivalry. In the audience and in living rooms around the world, people went crazy. But the moment wasn't about the performance. It was about the gesture. Mariah Carey, who had been positioned as Whitney's rival and potential replacement, had publicly chosen support over competition. After the show, during the backstage celebration, Whitney found Mariah. "Thank you," she said simply, "for what you did out there." "Thank you," Mariah replied, "for what you showed me today. I needed to see that even Whitney Houston struggles with being Whitney Houston. It made me feel less alone." Whitney pulled Mariah into a hug, and photographers captured the moment. But unlike previous photos of them together, which had always been analyzed for signs of tension or fakeness, this embrace was undeniably genuine. "Promise me something," Whitney said as they separated. "Promise that you won't let them do to you what they did to me. Don't let the pursuit of perfection steal your joy." "Only if you promise to try to find your joy again," Mariah countered. Whitney smiled, but was tinged with sadness. "I'll try, but I've been running this race for a long time. I don't know if I remember how to slow down." "Then maybe," Mariah suggested, "we help each other remember." The VH1 Divas live concert became one of the most watched and celebrated music specials of the 1990s. But for Mariah Carey, the real event wasn't what happened on stage. It was what she witnessed in the 4 hours before the show began. In the years that followed, Mariah spoke carefully but consistently about that experience, never betraying Whitney's specific vulnerabilities, but always emphasizing the humanity behind the legend. "That day taught me that we're all struggling with something," Mariah said in a 2002 interview. "The people who look the most perfect often carry the heaviest burdens. And the manufactured competition between women in this industry does real psychological damage." The relationship between Whitney and Mariah never became a close friendship. Their lives and careers continued on separate paths. But there was a mutual understanding between them from that day forward, a recognition of shared experience that transcended the media narratives. When Whitney's struggles with addiction became public in the early 2000s, Mariah was one of the few artists who spoke about her with compassion rather than judgment. "What people don't understand," Mariah told a reporter, "is that when you've been held to impossible standards for your entire career, when you've built your identity on being perfect, the pressure can break you." Whitney's battles weren't about weakness. They were about being human in an industry that didn't want her to be human. Years later, when Mariah faced her own public struggles with mental health and personal challenges, she credited that afternoon at the Beacon Theater with giving her perspective. "Watching Whitney that day showed me what happens when you don't address the psychological cost of fame," Mariah explained. "I decided I wasn't going to let that happen to me. I was going to be honest about my struggles, get help when I needed it, and refuse to pretend I was perfect." When Whitney Houston died in February 2012, Mariah was devastated. At Whitney's funeral, Mariah performed "I Will Always Love You," the song she had heard Whitney obsessively prepare 14 years earlier. As she sang, Mariah remembered the woman in the dressing room who questioned every note, who carried the weight of perfection like a physical burden, who longed to be seen as human rather than just as the voice. "I sang that song for the Whitney I met that day," Mariah later said. The vulnerable, frightened, incredibly talented woman who just wanted permission to be imperfect. And I hope, wherever she is, she finally found the peace that eluded her here. The story of what Mariah witnessed that afternoon at the Beacon Theater offers profound lessons that extend far beyond the music industry. It reveals the psychological cost of perfectionism, the damage done by manufactured competition, and the healing power of authentic human connection. Whitney Houston's story is a tragedy, but it's also a warning. When we put people on pedestals, when we demand perfection, when we forget that our heroes are human, we create impossible burdens that can destroy even the most extraordinary talents. The manufactured rivalry between Whitney and Mariah was profitable for media companies and created entertaining narratives for consumers. But it also contributed to an environment where two women who should have been celebrating each other's success were instead caught in a comparison trap that benefited everyone except them. Mariah's decision to seek understanding rather than accept the rivalry narrative was an act of both courage and wisdom. By witnessing Whitney's private struggles, she gained perspective that would shape her own career and help her navigate the same treacherous waters with more awareness and self-compassion. The moment during the finale when Mariah chose collaboration over competition was brief, lasting only a few seconds. But its symbolic power resonated far beyond that night. It suggested an alternative to the zero-sum game that the industry promoted, a possibility that multiple women could be excellent without diminishing each other. Most importantly, the story reminds us that behind every polished performance, every perfect note, every flawless appearance is a human being struggling with doubts, fears, and vulnerabilities. The people we admire most are often fighting invisible battles that we know nothing about. Whitney Houston was one of the greatest vocalists who ever lived, but she was also a woman trapped by her own legend, unable to escape the pressure of being the voice. The perfection we demanded from her became a prison that, ultimately, she couldn't escape. When we celebrate our heroes, we must remember to celebrate their humanity along with their achievements. When we admire excellence, we must also create space for imperfection. And when we compare one talent to another, we must recognize the psychological cost of those comparisons. Mariah Carey watched Whitney Houston prepare for 4 hours and learned that greatness comes at a price. The question we must all ask ourselves is whether that price is too high and what we can do to support the gifted people we admire without destroying them with our expectations. Because in the end, the greatest performances aren't the perfect ones. They're the honest ones delivered by artists who have permission to be fully, messily, imperfectly human. This incredible story shows us that behind the glamour and the glory, behind the legendary voices and sold-out stadiums, are real people carrying real burdens. What Mariah witnessed that day wasn't a diva preparing for a show. It was a woman fighting against the weight of perfection. If this story changed your perspective on the cost of fame and the price of being the best, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to understand that even legends struggle. Leave a comment about how we can better support the artists we admire without destroying them with impossible expectations. Subscribe and ring that bell because we have more stories that reveal the human truth behind the legends. Until next time, remember that perfection is a beautiful lie, and humanity is the only truth worth celebrating.